everyone. Welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. I am your host, not Gary Arndt. This is Joel Hermansen filling in for Gary Arndt, who, unfortunately, for those of you who are frequent listeners, Gary's Ironman streak has ended. The Cal Ripken of beer podcasting had to take a back seat on this episode. We're all struggling to try to fill in, and pick up a little bit of the slack. Fortunately, we have an incredible panel with us today. With me, as always, and I'm going to try a Gary Arndt type.
Ism.
Yeah, a Garyism. The brewer that Oklahoma Brewing and Science has designated as the most likely brewer to take nitrogen from Uranus and to turn it into a carbonated beverage. Our very own Bobby Fleshman. Bobby, how are you today?
I'm not responding. That was good and bad. That was awful.
There was a couple of errors there. I know that you have a different pronunciation of the...
You have your choice. It involves urine or the other one.
Right. But there is a lot of nitrogen on Uranus.
Yep, absolutely.
So you could clearly take that and start powering a stout over that.
Is Mitch still watching? Is he still here?
Yeah, no, Mitch is still here. We're going to get to Mitch. I'm also joined by Still Make Brewing's Stephanie Harvey. Stephanie, how are you?
Pretty good.
Good. Awesome. We, however, are blessed today to have one of the true stars in brewing, somebody I've been really excited to talk to, and that is Mitch Steele from New Realm Brewing. And Mitch, we're going to give you a chance to introduce yourself a little bit, but I've been reading up a lot about you. You are an interesting cat.
It doesn't seem that way from here, but yeah, thank you. It's good to be here. I've been in this business for, it's getting close to 40 years now. So I've seen a lot of things happen in craft beer and have been able to do a lot of different things, from my days at Anheuser-Busch to my days at Stone Brewing and now with New Realm. So it's been a crazy ride for sure.
And for those of you who aren't privileged to be staring at Mitch while he's saying this, I'm having a hard time reconciling the 40 years with your face. Because I'm wondering, is that you look like you're about 43. So I don't know how you're doing that. But...
Yeah, add 20 years to that and you'll be close.
Okay, well, that's... Congrats.
I guess beer keeps you young. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to prove that theory. I don't know if we...
It's like going to a high school reunion thinking that you're the only one that looks young and everyone else is aged. We've convinced ourselves of these kind of things. Yeah.
Right. I think when you hang out with a bunch of beer drinkers, then you kind of recalibrate your expectations. So
That's true.
So, Mitch, you have a fascinating backstory. You have done, your biography in brewing is kind of incredible. When I've been researching it, and we're currently holding a copy of your book as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I know that you and Bobby kind of had a little bit of a similar experience in that you're both UC Davis grads. I've never been in a room that's this many UC Davis people. This is
I guess your fermentation degree was as an undergrad. Is that right?
That's correct. I was a fermentation science major. I studied winemaking and brewing at Davis. Yeah, I graduated in 1984. And I got this new hat here. It's a UC Davis Brewing School hat. I picked that up at the Craft Brewers Conference last week, which I thought was kind of cool.
Nice.
Yeah, that is a great hat. So you started brewing in college, if I am remembering correctly. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I was, like I said, I was studying fermentation science. I had just taken the first brewing science course, and me and a really good friend of mine decided we were going to brew a batch of beer. So we did it at home. So that was my first home brewing experience. It was, an extract brew with whole hops and dry yeast and the whole bit. Like everybody else, we fermented in a white plastic bucket and packaged the beer up, and it was exceptionally bitter. And that's about all I remember about it.
And from that moment, were you hooked? I mean, because we've all had that same experience. And I think initially I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be a craft brewer. I'm going to be Ken Grossman, and I think
there's no wrong between not brewing at all.
I was going to go
Grossman.
from white bucket to Chico. It was a really short jump. So did you feel at that time that this was your passion? Like,
Ironically, I think I kind of knew it, but what really sealed the deal for me was about a year later, taking a field trip to Chico and visiting Sierra Nevada, and they had been open for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years at that time. I mean, they were still new. They were still brewing with and fermenting with open dairy tanks, and they had a 10 barrels, maybe a 15 barrel system. But, once we walked into that brewery and got to taste their beers and talk to them about how they were making their beers, I think that's really what put me over the edge and made me really realize, that brewing was something I wanted to pursue.
Were you with Michael Lewis at that time? Was
Yeah.
he a
Yeah.
professor? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
Michael Lewis was the professor,
Yeah.
and he's such an interesting dude, and really, he tells great stories, and he was pretty tough, but he had very high expectations of his students, and he let us know, But I liked Michael Lewis a lot. I've been lucky. I've been able to stay in touch with him off and on over the years in my career, and lean on him at times, and he's just a wonderful person, a great instructor.
Yeah, and I remember I took the extension course, and I remember him saying he's not teaching any of us how to run a business. I just glossed over that. He says, all we're learning here is how to brew. I thought, well, I can pick up the rest of it. And it's been the school of hard knocks ever since, for sure. But he's a really smart guy, and you're right. He is tough on you to get every bit of your vocabulary correct in your responses. That's for sure.
Yeah,
Being
absolutely.
as British as he can be.
Yes, exactly. He was a pretty intimidating man. I really had to drum up a
imagine.
lot of courage to, when I was deciding to kind of focus on brewing, I went in to talk to him, and, and he had his office hours, and I went in and talked to him, and I was scared to death, because I'd only seen him in like big lecture halls, guest lecturing about microbiology or something. And a lot of the people who were focusing on winemaking saying, I could never be a brewer. I could never take classes from that man. But, I got enough courage and went in there and had a great conversation with him, and just went from there.
This is a decade before the lovable Charlie Bamforth arrived, right?
Yeah. I think it was about 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
have you met Charlie?
Yeah. I've met Charlie. I know Charlie.
What a treasure.
Yeah.
Oh,
I love
There's a lot of
listening
crushes
to
in
him.
here.
I just like listening to him talk. I mean, the man is brilliant, obviously. He was a perfect successor to Michael Lewis, but, just listening to him talk and the humor in his stories, and the man's, he's genuinely funny, and, let alone knowing everything there is to know about brewing good glass of beer. But yeah, Charlie Bamforth is wonderful.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Mitch, when you first decided to open the brew pub in Hollister,
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through a little bit about that origin story? Because a lot of the work that we do here on this podcast, and that's why I'm glad that Stephanie's here today. Bobby just alluded to it. Putting great fluid in a glass is only one part of the journey, and we have tried to highlight some of the the ups and downs and lessons. And it's kind of been, almost like an oral history of the journey that McFleshman's has had from conceptual idea to what the people here would consider to be the best brewery in the state of Wisconsin, a place that has a lot of good breweries. So can you talk a little bit about your own journey at the brew pub that you opened? And
He's impressed with our humility right now, I think.
well, I'm not. Bobby is. Bobby would say, I don't even know if we're the best brewers on the block, but that's that.
Not to interrupt that.
Right. I don't have that same Oklahoma sensibility. So anyway, Hollister, origin story. How did that go?
Yeah, it's so, just to set the table here, I was working full time at a winery at the time in Hollister, California. For those that don't know where it is, it's about 45 minutes south of San Jose, California. So it's still considered part of the greater Bay Area of California, although it's closer to Monterey than it is to anything in the Bay Area. But, it's a farm town, and I was working for a company that had 2 wineries in the area south of town. And that was my full-time job. And I just picked up the local paper and read an article about a gentleman who was starting a brewery in town. And this was right about the time when I was starting to think seriously about trying to do that myself. So I got out the phone book and I looked up his number and I called him and I said, I'd love to just come see what you've got going on here. I'm a UC Davis brewing science grad. I'm working in a winery down the road and have been wanting to get into brewing for a little while. And I'd love to see what you're doing. Now, this was Bill Millar who started the company. So he really started it. I can't claim any credit for putting that brewery together. When I walked in, he had already ordered the equipment. He had the building. It was an old creamery in downtown Hollister that had been closed for a while. And, so it had tile floors and it had drains and everything else. And he got the building, he leased it, and we put equipment in there and put the brewing equipment over in a room that had tile floors and drains. And, I walked in there and the equipment hadn't showed up yet, but he had it all laid out. And we chatted and, my intent was just to kind of get a feel for what he was going through to start it up so that I could do the same at some point. And we ended 2 hours later, we ended the conversation. He said, I don't have a brewer yet. And I said, really? And he goes, you want the job? And I said, sure. And so I joined forces with Bill. But as life happens, this article that I had read in the paper, unfortunately, his bosses at the tomato cannery also read this article and they fired him for having a second job. And he ended up having to take a full-time job in the brewery he was starting with, and his wife worked there as well. And I basically moonlighted for 4 years there, and I helped create all the beers. I did some brewing for him. I did bartending for him. It became my hangout, and it was a pretty cool experience. But it was a tough business. This was 1987 and 88. And
Before all the shirtless models wearing jeans came to town.
yeah, exactly. But it was a hard town to sell craft beer in, because 99% of the town drank Budweiser or Coors products, but we were there with some of those early brewers that started in the 1980s in California in the Bay Area, Gordon Biersch and my gosh, Triple Rock and Winchester. And there were a whole bunch of breweries that were starting up right around then. So there was something happening, but, we made a go of it. And, it turned into a family business for Bill, which I know was not his original intent, but I worked there for 4 years, realized it was never going to grow to a point where he could afford to bring me on full time and I'd still be able to pay my bills. So, and with his blessing, I started looking for some other jobs in the industry. But I at that time, I felt it was time to, move away from winemaking and really focus on brewing as my career.
So you guys, there's a little bit of overlap in your stories. Your work that you had with Stone Arch kind of leading, some of their work.
I guess there's some truth to that. There's about a 3,500 barrel brewery per year, a small one that I was involved with doing that many barrels on a 7-barrel system. You can run that.
A lot.
You can run that math. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. So I got to get my hands on some pretty good statistics there because you can imagine how many turns we're doing, and with one yeast strain and so forth. So yeah, I can appreciate where this lineage goes.
And from the experience in Hollister, you ended up at Budweiser for a time.
Right.
Now, a lot of our listeners are going to be familiar with what I'm about to say next, but Bobby has said this on a number of occasions, and I'll let you fill in the rest. But you've talked about the quality of brewing that happens at these macro breweries and that it would be an excellent place to learn.
I don't think I'm the guy that should be telling that story.
No, but I want your quote, and then we'll have Mitch respond to it.
Well, I think my quote is just that I kind of echo Charlie's sentiment about quality and how it is having control of process and making something repeatable. Whether or not someone enjoys it or not, it's not the point. And that control. I don't think anyone has it, such as the large macro brewers do.
Right. Would you concur with that?
Yeah, I would, especially back in 1992 when I was looking at joining them. Anheuser-Busch has always had a very strong relationship with UC Davis. And so Michael Lewis was a big fan of Anheuser-Busch. A lot of the graduates of the program at Davis went on to careers with Anheuser-Busch. And, so I had a not quite a foot in the door, but almost, just because of my degree and where it came from. But yeah, Anheuser-Busch, both Michael and Charlie preached about how, about quality and consistency and managing the brewing process and how good Anheuser-Busch was at it. And, and I went into it thinking, and I was applying to breweries all over the country and just places I thought I might enjoy living. I'd grown up in California and spent all my life there for the most part. And, it was just, there was part of me that was also looking to try something different and explore a little bit, part of the country. But, I figured if I got on with Anheuser-Busch, I would stick with it for 5 years and try and learn as much as I can about how to run a brewery and how to manage the processes, the brewing processes, how to track things, what you need to check for, which, it went on and on. That company knew how to make beer, and the people that were making the beer in that company were as passionate about what they were doing as any craft brewer is. It's with the exception of the creativity part, which I think is a big component of craft beer. At Anheuser-Busch, you were brewing what you were told to brew, and there was somebody in St. Louis or a group of people in St. Louis who were deciding how that beer should be made. But within those parameters, you had to really make sure you were doing everything right, and everything in that process was monitored and checked and observed, and it was really a pretty unbelievable thing to walk into from my experience.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then you ended up at Stone. And I have to tell you that way back in the early 2000s, I know it for you was probably a little earlier, but it was like a quest for people to try to get their hands on an arrogant bastard. Like that was like trying to get your hands on a Zombie Dust, a Heady Topper, a Pliny the Elder. Because when you're from outside the region, that was like one of the Mount Rushmore beers where, one person would get, the liter bottle of Arrogant Bastard, and we would all gather around it and look at it.
Oh yeah, the big.
The big one.
So I sort of was at the beginning of my brewing journey. I was raised on all of the personalities on the Brewing Network. So Jamil Zane's chef, and I know you have yet the collaboration or had that with him. And I was thinking back to one of his shows, the Can You Brew It? And they were trying to get out of you how to brew that beer.
Oh my gosh.
I guess it was Tasty McDowell that thinks he nailed it. And I guess your silence was the answer. But
that was so fun.
Yeah.
And you know what? Jamil and Tasty became extremely good friends through that whole process. And I just really adore both of them. They're both, they were both great people. Jamil's a great person. Tasty, I miss him tremendously, now that he's gone. But I mean, that was, it's funny. When I joined Anheuser-Busch, I gave myself kind of a 5-year plan. I got promoted in year 3 and moved to St. Louis and got put in charge of new products for Anheuser-Busch for about 4 years. And really that was, that kept me there for another 4 years. And, I was learning all about brewing different types of traditional beer styles and some new craft beer styles and things like that. And then I got transferred to Merrimack, New Hampshire to run the brew house and the fermenting cellar of their brewery there. And I had done a lot of work there when I was doing new products because a lot of them were being made in New Hampshire. And I just fell in love with the area. And I ended up staying at Anheuser-Busch for 14 years, and when I went in with a 5-year plan. It was a good career for a long time, but, all good things come to an end, and it was starting to get kind of the corporateness of Anheuser-Busch and it was starting to wear me down a bit. And so when I saw the head brewer job open at Stone, and my wife and I had just been in San Diego like 6 months before and really enjoyed it. And I remember calling her over to the computer and I said, "Hey, look, Stone's looking for a head brewer. They're in San Diego." And she encouraged me to apply, and so, yeah, I went to Stone in 2006, and working for Greg and Steve was completely different than working for Anheuser-Busch, and I enjoyed the heck out of it. It was wonderful.
Was it as advertised, like the way they presented themselves to the world and through marketing? Was it the same way behind closed doors?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, Greg's pretty genuine.
Yeah.
He wasn't faking it. He wasn't putting on an act. He believed everything that he said, and he was about as passionate as anybody I had met. Steve Wagner was kind of the quiet guy in the partnership, but he was the one that ran the breweries, and he was the one that made sure that the breweries were set up properly, that we hired good people, and everything else. So Steve was the original brewmaster. And after a few years of being there, first as head brewer and then head brewer and production manager, Steve promoted me to brewmaster so he could start focusing on more of the business, and he let me run the breweries. But the people there are called Steve and Greg yin and yang. And I mean, Greg and Steve were polar opposites in personality and in the way they dealt with things and people and everything else. It made for a pretty interesting and work environment for sure. And Greg is Greg. I mean, he's the one that came up with all the stuff on the back of the Arrogant Bastard label. He came up with the concept. He was a genius in a lot of ways. He came up with some really neat ideas before I got there. I got there when they were just going into their 10th year. So they had been around for a while and established themselves. But, Greg was pretty much, as advertised, definitely. And, it was a fun place to work for, I worked there for 10 years and it was a wonderful experience. Some of the best times I've ever had. Yeah.
And then from Stone, you opened the New Realm facilities. Is that
Yeah. So
the next step in the ladder?
Yeah, in 2016, I was approached by a couple of people who I'd never crossed paths with at Anheuser-Busch, but they had worked Anheuser-Busch sales and logistics and national accounts and things like that. They were pretty high up the ladder, and they left after InBev had bought Anheuser-Busch or taken over Anheuser-Busch, however you want to word it. Eventually they left and were doing other things, and they wanted to start a brewery in the Southeast. And they approached me, and I said no. I said, I'm real happy here at Stone. My daughter is just starting high school. I'm, in a good spot. I've had a great run at Stone. I really enjoy it. And they were very persistent. And, they wanted to start the company that became New Realm. They wanted to headquarter that company in Asheville, North Carolina. And I loved Asheville, North Carolina, and I still do. I think it's one of the most beautiful places in the country. It's got a really cool vibe, a lot of great breweries, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, wow, this is my chance to move to Asheville and I could stay here the rest of my life. And then that would be great, and that didn't work out, but they eventually wore me down, I guess, and they offered to fly me back and forth while my daughter finished high school in California, because I absolutely was not going to move while she was in high school. And so for 3 years, I commuted from San Diego to Atlanta. We ended up building our first brewery in Atlanta, which I wasn't expecting at all. It wasn't on our short list of places we were talking about when I was interviewing with them. But Kerry, who's still here, he's our CEO, lived in the Atlanta area and found this building that turned out to be incredible. And so that's where we landed. But I've been at New Realm since 2016. We started brewing beer in late 2017. And, ever since.
What was the most difficult part of opening your own shop? Because you'd been a part of a new facility in Hollister, but you weren't the proprietor. You weren't,
Right.
Pulling the levers. Then you moved to Stone, which was more established. What was the most challenging part of doing it from the ground up? And again, for those of you who are listeners, you probably are familiar with Bobby's story about that same thing. And then I want to connect you, because you were an eyewitness to some of those same days. So anyway, Mitch, what was the most difficult part in that journey?
Oh my gosh, there were so many things that were hard. I mean, the kind of facetious but true answer is that naming the company was the hardest thing we did. We couldn't come up with a name to save our lives. And I think I realized at that point that Carrie and Bob and I were very different people. We had a stack of names that, half an inch to an inch thick that just didn't pass. Everybody had veto power. So if one person didn't like the name, we moved on. But that being said, I think, the permitting, getting the permits and getting the inspections done, making sure that we were covering all of our bases with utilities and trying not to go over budget. All of those were incredibly difficult, and we succeeded in some ways and didn't in other ways. We went way over budget. We didn't, when we walked in, we had to get, we had to get more power to the building. We had to get more water to the building, all those things you don't think about when you're looking at a building and kind of envisioning how cool it's going to be when you're done. Selecting the equipment was hard, a lot of different things to consider. I think just from a brewer's perspective, getting all the quotes on all the equipment and trying to compare apples to apples was incredibly difficult because they all quote very differently and they had different pieces of equipment. So you're trying to kind of put things on an even playing field or a level playing field. And you couldn't do it because all the quotes were so radically different in the way they were formatted and what was included and what wasn't. So working through all that stuff, not brewing for 2 years was really hard. That sucked. I really missed it. And the whole hazy IPA thing really took off when we were planning and building our brewery. So I missed that boat completely. So that was hard. But there were a lot of things that were really hard.
You wanted to put Stephanie on the spot.
I've heard your perspective. I would like a third party perspective.
Just drink my beer.
Oh. So I work at a brewery like 40 minutes away from McFleshman's, but I was at McFleshman's year one, just so you know, Mitch. But I sort of got to come in where Bobby and the McFleshman's crew like kind of knew what they wanted to do and they like had a plan. And then I came in and told them how wrong they were doing everything, basically. But yeah, I think like even you were saying, Joel, I think a lot of people homebrew and they're like, well, my friends love it. I'm really good at it. These are the styles I should make. I should open up my own brewery.
Yeah, people love free beer. They absolutely love free beer.
Taste better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's just a lot of things, even like you said about all the little stuff you don't really consider when you think about opening your own place, which I didn't get to witness here because the building was already here for almost a year before I started. But the rest of it, just how important
the brand building,
marketing, and brand building is. You could have the best liquid in the world or on the block or in the state or in the city. But at the end of the day, if people aren't picking it up, it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. Nobody cares how good your beer is. Yeah. And so that's kind of where I came in at McFleshman's and was constantly saying, nobody cares. Like, yes, this English IPA is so delicious. I don't want to sell it. Nobody cares. So.
Right.
I totally relate to that. I mean, when we started brewing, we started brewing some classic beer styles. We brewed a pale ale, we had a porter, we had a West Coast IPA. Everybody complained about our beers. They're too bitter. They're, and
what? It's San Diego brewer.
I know. I'm like, you know who you hired, right? You know where I'm coming from here. I'm brew beers this way, and this is the way I do it. And to be honest, once we got started, that was probably the hardest thing I had to deal with was to start.
And that's going to wrap up this episode of Respecting the Beer. Come back next week as we continue our conversation with Mitch Steele of New Round Brewing. If you have an idea for another brewer that we should have on the podcast, reach out to us at respectingthebeer@gmail.com or head on over to our Facebook page to make a recommendation. You can also support the show over on Patreon, where you can get episodes a week ahead of time and special beers brewed specifically for the Patreon members. The show is produced by me, David Kelso, with music by Sarah Lynn Huss. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.